That morning, the rain didn't just fall, it attacked. Sheets of water hammered Boston's streets, a relentless gray curtain that blurred even the tallest towers. My hands clenched the steering wheel, knuckles white, as I sat in my car outside Whitman and Ellis, the law firm where the reading of Eleanor Carter's will was about to begin. Eleanor, my former mother-in-law, the only woman who ever treated me like family when no one else did, had been gone 4 days. I told myself I came here for closure, not for money. But when I stepped out into the storm, the first thing I saw under the dry overhang was Mason, my ex-husband, tailored and smug in his navy suit, and beside him Arya, the woman he'd left me for, her lips red, her silk scarf untouched by the weather, their newborn son bundled in her arms like some trophy. Their eyes cut through me, cold and triumphant. I almost turned away, almost, but then I remembered Eleanor's last words to me. "You're stronger than you think, Harper." So I walked past them, heels steady against the storm, ready to face whatever truths she had left behind. Before I take you into that room, before everything shifts, please subscribe to my channel. Tap the bell so you don't miss what comes next, and share this with someone who's ever had to reclaim their dignity in the middle of a storm. Long before that morning in Boston, before the storm and the confrontation, my life had already been unraveling thread by thread. People like to think that marriages collapse in one spectacular moment, a betrayal uncovered, a fight too loud to forget. But mine with Mason Carter eroded slowly, like stone ground down by water. No bruises, no screaming, just silence that grew until it swallowed every corner of our home. When I first met Mason, I believed in him. He was polished, confident, always speaking as though the world bent toward his will. To everyone else, he was magnetic. To me, in those early days, he was possibility. I came from little, a childhood where bills were paid late, where my mother worked 2 jobs and still apologized at the grocery store when her card declined. Mason represented something steadier. At least, that's what I told myself. But steadiness can be a disguise for control. I didn't notice the subtle corrections at first. How he'd adjust my sentences at dinner parties. How he'd tighten his hand on my back when I laughed too loudly. How he'd compliment me only in terms of how I reflected on him. "You looked perfect tonight, Harper." "Everyone said so." Perfect wasn't a compliment. Perfect was a leash. The only person who ever noticed was Eleanor Carter, Mason's mother. She wasn't the warm, overbearing type. She was precise, intentional. A woman who had lived long enough to know the difference between charm and integrity. She invited me over for tea more than anyone else did. She'd ask me how I was in a way that made it impossible to just say fine. When Mason canceled dinner at the last minute, it was Eleanor who opened her door to me, handed me a towel for my rain-soaked coat, and said, "You deserve more than waiting rooms and empty apologies." I didn't know then how much those words would anchor me. By the 5th year of our marriage, Mason had perfected his double life. He was the doting son at Eleanor's Sunday lunches, the ambitious professional at every gala, the charming host at dinners with his colleagues. But behind closed doors, he was a man who retreated into late nights at the office, a man who smelled of perfume that wasn't mine, a man whose phone was always turned face down on the nightstand. I tried. God, I tried. I cooked his favorite meals, wore the dresses he liked, even softened my voice when I brought up the distance between us. But trying with Mason was like pouring water into a cracked vase. It never filled. It only leaked. And every time I asked where he'd been, he'd look at me with that flat calmness that said, "You're overreacting." The night I found the first lipstick stain on his shirt wasn't loud. I didn't scream. I just folded the shirt neatly and placed it on his side of the bed. When he came home and saw it, he didn't deny it. He didn't confess either. He just sighed, as though I'd inconvenienced him, and said, "Don't make this ugly, Harper." That was Mason, always afraid of ugliness, never afraid of betrayal. It wasn't long before Aria Reed became more than a shadow. I knew of her long before I saw her. The excuses grew thinner, the lies clumsier. When I finally confronted him, Mason didn't argue. He just looked at me the way someone looks at an old piece of furniture. Useful once, but no longer worth repairing. The divorce was fast, efficient. He made sure of it. The house went to him, the accounts were divided with clinical precision, and I was left with silence. People whispered, of course. In his world, perception was everything, and I became the woman who couldn't hold her husband's attention. He was already showing Aria off by then, her youth, her gloss, her easy adoration. She was his new costume, and I was the discarded one. If not for Eleanor, I might have crumbled entirely. She didn't take sides publicly, she never would, but privately, she made sure I never felt erased. She'd call me for tea, still invite me to her sunroom, still tell me stories about her childhood in Willow Creek, as though reminding me that there was a world beyond Mason's. Sometimes she'd say things that didn't make sense then, but echo now. Quiet women carry the heaviest truths. Or, glaciers move so slowly you don't notice until the entire landscape is different. Looking back, I realized she had been preparing me for this storm long before it arrived. She knew who her son had become. She saw through the performance. And maybe she saw me too, not just as the woman left behind, but as someone worth choosing. When she passed, I felt the ground shift beneath me again. Grief is heavy, but what hurt more was the unfinishedness of it all. I hadn't seen her in weeks, and part of me worried she thought I'd given up, drifted too far. But the letter that came from Whitman and Ellis proved otherwise. She hadn't forgotten me. She had left instructions. And so I sat in my car outside the law firm that rainy morning, heart pounding harder than the storm outside, knowing I was about to step into a room where I didn't belong anymore, and yet, somehow, belonged more than anyone else. People think success always comes dressed in grandeur, towering office windows, tailored suits, champagne toasts under glittering chandeliers. But the kind of success I found didn't look like any of that. Mine smelled of cinnamon and coffee grounds, of fresh paint and warm, honey-colored walls. It sounded like the gentle ring of a bell above a door, the shuffle of mismatched chairs, and the quiet hum of strangers who slowly became regulars. After the reading of Eleanor's will, after the shock in Mason's face and the bitterness twisting Aria's smile, I left Boston behind. I sold what needed to be sold, packed what little I cared to carry, and drove to Maplewood, the town Eleanor had told me about in stories that felt almost like fairy tales. She'd described it once during a winter storm, a quiet place where she'd dreamed of returning, where she'd once felt most like herself. I understood why the moment I arrived. The air was different there, still, uncluttered, threaded with the scent of pine and soil. Instead of car horns and restless crowds, there were porch lights and sidewalks cracked by roots of old trees. Maplewood wasn't perfect. It was small, fading in places, but it was real. And for the first time in years, so was I. On Main Street, a forgotten storefront caught my eye. Its windows were dusty, its wooden floors warped and groaning, the faded sign above the door reading only books and brews. To anyone else, it was ruin. To me, it was possibility. With Eleanor's inheritance, I could have bought something polished, something move-in ready. But I didn't want polished. I wanted something I could shape with my own hands. So I signed the papers with Caleb Porter, the owner who seemed stunned anyone even wanted the place, and I walked into the broken room with a mop and a dream. I named it the Ember House because it wasn't about fire roaring high. It was about the quiet glow that stays, the warmth you gather around. At first, it was nothing more than peeling paint and my determination, but little by little, it grew. I scrubbed until my fingers ached, painted the walls a warm golden hue, sanded the floors smooth. With the help of Ethan Cole, a local carpenter who smelled of cedar and coffee, I built a counter from reclaimed barnwood. Every mismatched chair I found at flea markets and yard sales became part of the story. And then there was the menu. I started simple. Tea steeped just right, strong coffee, pastries baked from recipes Eleanor had handed me in her careful cursive. Her apple pie took me 4 attempts before I got the crust just the way she would have approved. Flaky, golden, dusted with cinnamon. When I set it on the counter the first time, I whispered to the empty room, "I hope you'd be proud." The Ember House opened without fanfare. No ribbon cutting, no press release, just a hand-lettered sign that read, "Open," and the ring of that little brass bell above the door. My first customers were 2 sisters in their 70s, Grace Delaney and her twin, who shared Earl Grey and half a slice of pie between them. Grace looked at me over her glasses and said, "This tastes like something worth staying for." Word spread slowly, like a secret the town wasn't sure it wanted to share. But soon enough, the Ember House found its rhythm. Nolan Brooks, a high school senior, came in with heavy textbooks and ordered hot chocolate with extra whipped cream, lingering for hours. Wyatt Reed, an older man with tired eyes, stopped by each morning with his dog Bella, and though he never smiled, he always returned his mug with a gruff, "Good cup." Charlotte Hayes, widowed the year before, sat by the window with chamomile and knitting needles, grateful for company without questions. And Isla Kim, a teenager from down the street, began helping me on Fridays, trading dishwashing for baking lessons. These people, these small, ordinary moments, became my new measure of success. Not the applause Mason once chased. Not the carefully curated image Arya wore like silk, but real, tangible warmth. A place where people came not because they had to, but because it felt like home. Sometimes at night, I'd sit by the window with a steaming mug, watching the glow of the Ember House reflect in the glass, and I'd think, this is what Eleanor wanted for me. Not the burden of wealth or the cold armor of legacy, but space, freedom. A chance to build something that was mine alone. And so, in the quiet hum of Maplewood, surrounded by the steady rhythm of new beginnings, I finally understood. Success isn't about being seen by the world. It's about finally seeing yourself. The Ember House had been open for nearly 6 months when the bell above the door rang one afternoon and froze the air in my lungs. I was behind the counter, wiping down mugs still warm from the morning rush, the scent of cinnamon lingering in the air, when I looked up and saw him. Mason Carter. At first, I thought the storm outside had conjured him, that I was seeing some specter from a life I had finally buried. But no, it was him, in the flesh, framed by the doorway like a ghost that refused to stay gone. His hair was longer, less precise. His navy suit rumpled at the edges. The shine dulled from his shoes. For the first time, Mason didn't look like control. He looked like loss. He stood there, scanning the space with hollow eyes until they landed on me. "Harper," he said, his voice lower than I remembered, almost cracked. The room stilled. Grace Delaney, who sat knitting in her corner with tea, paused mid-stitch. Nolan Brooks looked up from his textbook. Even Wyatt Reed's dog Bella let out a soft whine, as if sensing tension in the air. I didn't move. I stayed behind the counter, steadying my breath. This was my world now, not his. He took a hesitant step forward. "I heard you were here." I said nothing. Silence was my armor. The same kind Eleanor had once told me carried more weight than any outburst. Mason glanced around again, his jaw tightening as if the warmth of the Ember House unsettled him. "You did all this?" "Yes," I replied, flat, giving him nothing else. He nodded, swallowing hard. "It's beautiful." I didn't thank him. His compliments had always been currency, traded to keep me tethered. I wouldn't let them hook me again. "I came to say I'm sorry," he blurted then, too quickly, like the words had been rehearsed. "For everything. For the lies. For—" His voice trailed, unable to finish. The words didn't land. They felt like crumpled receipts, evidence of what once was, meaningless now. "You look different," he tried again, softer this time. "I am," I said. Something flickered in his eyes, something like panic. He shoved his hands into his pockets, his shoulders slumping. "I lost everything, Harper. The business is gone. Aria, she left, took the baby, moved to Austin. I haven't even seen him in months." His voice broke on the last word. "I don't have anyone now." The café felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. Customers sipped quietly, pretending not to listen, though every ear strained toward us. I raised an eyebrow, but kept my tone even. "That's not my problem." Mason flinched. "I know. I didn't know where else to go." "Then why are you here?" He took a step closer to the counter. "Because I thought maybe, just maybe, you could forgive me. That you could look at me the way you used to. Like I was worth something." A bitter laugh escaped me, sharp and low. "The woman who used to look at you like you were worth saving doesn't exist anymore." He looked gutted. "I made mistakes." "No," I said, stepping out from behind the counter, closing the distance just enough so he could see the steel in my eyes. "You made choices. Choices that erased me. Choices that replaced me. And now, because those choices crumbled, because the applause is gone, you come crawling back? That's not love, Mason. That's desperation." His face twisted, grief and shame tangling in a mess he couldn't disguise. For once, there was no polished mask, no smug composure, just a man standing in the wreckage he built. Around us, the Ember House held its breath. The golden walls, the mismatched chairs, the little bell above the door, they all bore witness to this moment, this reckoning. Mason tried again, his voice raw. "I don't want your money. I don't want the inheritance. He faltered, lowering his gaze. "I just miss you." I shook my head slowly. "No, Mason. You missed the version of me who made you feel important, and the second I stopped, you went looking for someone else. Silence. Only the hum of the old radio in the corner carried through the room. Finally, I walked past him to the door, pulling it open. The autumn wind pushed in, carrying the scent of rain and maple leaves. You came, you saw, and now you leave, I said, my voice steady. This place isn't yours. This version of me isn't yours. For a moment, I thought he might fight back, argue, beg, but he didn't. He just nodded, shoulders collapsing inward, and stepped out into the misty street. The bell above the door chimed once, then fell silent. I closed the door behind him, my hands trembling. Not from fear, but from release. The customers who had been frozen slowly returned to their conversations, their sips, their knitting, as if life inside the Ember House could simply resume. And it did, because Mason was gone, and I was still here. The day after Mason appeared at the Ember House, I woke up before dawn, unable to shake the echo of his voice. He had stood in front of me, stripped of his polish, a man begging for something I no longer had to give. I should have felt triumphant, but instead, I felt unsettled. Because if Mason had shown up here, in Maplewood, it meant he hadn't simply accepted Eleanor's decision. Men like him never did. They circled, tested, probed for weakness. They believed everything could still be bent back in their favor. As the sky turned pale gray, I sat at the kitchen table with Eleanor's old journal, one of the few things of hers I had kept after the will was settled. I traced the loops of her handwriting, the sharp lines of her notes, wondering if she had anticipated this too. Quiet strength is still strength, she had written once. But sometimes the quiet must be tested to prove it isn't weakness. I decided then. If Mason was circling, I needed to know how close. The first test was simple. I asked Isla Kim, the teenage girl who helped me on Fridays, to keep her ears open around town. Maplewood wasn't Boston. Here, nothing stayed secret for long. If Mason lingered, if he asked questions, people would notice. Isla was sharp, sharper than she let on, and she came back the next week with news. He's been at the diner twice, she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Didn't eat much. Just sat there, asking about you, asking about the Ember House. The knot in my chest tightened, though I kept my expression even. What did people tell him? She shrugged. That you're doing fine. That the Ember House is the only place worth stopping for tea. But he didn't look happy hearing that. Of course he didn't. Mason had always been threatened by my independence, even before it was visible. To know that I had built something without him, something thriving, must have gnawed at him like acid. The second test came unannounced. Late one evening, after closing, I heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel behind the Ember House. My heart hammered, but I didn't turn on the lights. Instead, I waited by the window, watching. There he was, half shrouded in the dim streetlight, standing across the road as if deciding whether to knock. He didn't. He simply lingered for 10 minutes, staring at the front door, before retreating into the shadows. I could have confronted him, but sometimes silence says more than confrontation. I let him walk away without acknowledgement, a deliberate act of dismissal. Still, unease followed me. Eleanor had left me her estate not out of charity, but out of trust. She had seen Mason for what he was, a man who traded loyalty for charm, who believed legacy was his by right. If he was here, circling, then perhaps He hadn't just lost Aria and the baby and the business. Perhaps he was desperate enough to try reclaiming what Eleanor had denied him. So I tested again. This time, I went into Boston quietly, without telling anyone. I visited Benjamin Harris, the attorney who had read Eleanor's will. His office smelled of paper and polish, and he adjusted his glasses as I explained. I need to know if Mason has tried anything. Contesting, appealing, filing claims. Benjamin leaned back, thoughtful. Not formally, but his calls have been persistent. He wants meetings, he wants explanations, he wants to know why his mother would have done this. And what do you tell him? I asked. The truth, Benjamin replied, that the will is airtight, that Eleanor was lucid, clear, and deliberate. But men like your ex-husband, they don't accept clarity. They look for cracks. I nodded slowly. So he's still circling? Yes, but he hasn't made a move yet. That was a comfort, though a fragile one. Because if there was one thing I knew about Mason, it was that patience wasn't in his nature. He'd wait only as long as it took to convince himself there was an opening. When I returned to Maplewood, I noticed how my regulars looked at me with quiet concern. Grace Delaney left an extra scone on the counter, muttering, "For strength." Wyatt Reed lingered longer than usual, his dog Bella resting her head on the counter as if to remind me I wasn't alone. Even Nolan Brooks, usually absorbed in his textbooks, asked softly, "Are you okay?" I smiled at them, grateful, but inside I was sharpening. Eleanor's words echoed again. Sometimes the people who erase you are the ones who fear you the most. Mason had tried to erase me once. He had failed. Now if he feared me, or what I represented, then perhaps that fear was its own weapon. The final test came on a rainy Tuesday. The café was nearly empty when Mason walked in again. No pretense this time. No rehearsed lines. He looked wrecked, as though the rain had stripped him bare. "I need 5 minutes," he said quietly. I didn't invite him to sit. I didn't pour him coffee. I simply stood there, steady, while he shifted on his feet. "I can't carry this anymore," he admitted, his voice trembling. "The failure, the loss, the way she—" He stopped, swallowing. "The way Eleanor chose you." And there it was, the truth he had been circling around. Not love, not forgiveness. Control. He couldn't stand that his mother had trusted me more than him. That her legacy lived in my hands, not his. "You're not carrying it," I told him. "You're trying to drop it in front of me and hope I'll pick it up. But I won't." For a long moment, he just stared, searching my face for the softness that once saved him. But that woman no longer lived here. The Ember House had burned her ashes into something stronger. Finally, Mason left again, shoulders slumped, the bell above the door chiming like a verdict. I knew then the tests were over. He had revealed himself as predictable as ever, and I had proven to him and to myself that I wasn't the woman he remembered. I wasn't waiting to be chosen. I had already chosen myself. The Ember House glowed warm around me, filled with mismatched chairs, the hum of jazz, the quiet belonging of people who saw me for who I was. And somewhere outside, Mason wandered, still circling, but circling a fortress he could no longer breach. The week after Mason's second return, I felt a shift in the air around Maplewood. It wasn't loud or obvious, but subtle, like the way birds grow restless before a storm. People lowered their voices when they mentioned his name. The diner owner, a sharp-eyed woman named Carol, told Isla she didn't like how often Mason sat in the corner booth, not ordering more than a cup of coffee, staring out the window like he was waiting. I knew then that silence wasn't enough. It was time to gather what Eleanor had always urged me to hold on to: evidence, truth, clarity. She had left me her estate because she believed in me, but belief wasn't enough to keep Mason from trying to unravel everything. If he wanted to circle, I would make sure there was nothing for him to land on. I started with Benjamin Harris, Eleanor's attorney. I drove back into Boston, rain streaking across my windshield, my heart steady in a way it hadn't been in years. Benjamin greeted me with his usual calm. "I had a feeling I'd be seeing you," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Your ex-husband has been calling again, more insistent this time." "Insistent how?" I asked. "He requested copies of every clause." He implied Eleanor might have been persuaded. "He hasn't filed anything, but he's gathering his own kind of ammunition." Benjamin leaned forward. "If I may, Harper, men like Mason rarely attack head-on. They chip away, hoping the foundation cracks." "I won't give him that chance," I said. Benjamin smiled faintly, almost proud. "Good. Then let's make sure you're prepared." He handed me a folder: certified copies of the will, notarized statements from the witnesses, and medical reports verifying Eleanor's soundness of mind during the final signing. Paper armor, but armor nonetheless. I tucked them into my bag like weapons. Back in Maplewood, I tested the next layer of defense: the community. Mason had always underestimated people he thought beneath his attention: servers, cashiers, quiet neighbors. But Maplewood wasn't Boston. Here, people noticed, remembered, connected dots. I began to ask gentle questions, the kind that didn't raise alarms but opened doors. At the hardware store, Caleb Porter told me Mason had asked if the Ember House was profitable. "Odd question, considering it's none of his business," Caleb muttered, sliding my receipt across the counter. "But don't worry, Harper. Folks here don't trust men who circle without purpose." At the farmer's market, Charlotte Hayes whispered that Mason had tried to charm her, asking if I seemed overwhelmed running the café alone. "I told him you were the steadiest person I knew," she said, patting my hand firmly. He didn't like that answer. Even Wyatt Reed, who rarely spoke more than 2 words, mentioned Mason one morning as he sipped his black coffee. "Saw him sniffing around behind the post office, asking about the deeds." "Don't let him rattle you, Harper. A man like that, hollow. Hollow things collapse when no one props them up." Their words built a picture. Mason wasn't simply wandering. He was probing, looking for cracks. He had nothing solid yet, but he was hungry for any weakness he could twist into leverage. So I dug deeper. Late one night, after closing the Ember House, I unlocked Eleanor's cedar chest, the one piece of furniture I'd brought from her Boston house. Tucked beneath old linens, I found a stack of letters bound with twine. They weren't addressed to me, but to herself. Private notes, thoughts she'd written in her last months. Her handwriting was weaker but steady, each loop deliberate. One line struck me cold. "Mason believes legacy is his by right, but legacy belongs to those who honor it, not those who assume it." Another: "I see Harper more clearly than I see my own son. Strength isn't in charm, it's in endurance." Tears blurred my vision, but I forced myself to keep reading. Every page was evidence, not legal perhaps, but moral. Proof that Eleanor's decision hadn't been sudden or coerced, but considered, rooted in love and truth. I made copies of each letter, storing them in a locked drawer at the Ember House. If Mason ever tried to claim Eleanor had been manipulated, I would show him her voice in ink, unshaken until the end. The next piece of evidence came from an unexpected place. Aria. One rainy afternoon, Isla rushed into the café, breathless. "She's here," she whispered, "at the inn, with the baby." I froze. "Aria?" Isla nodded. "I heard her arguing on the phone with Mason. She said she left for a reason." For hours I debated whether to go. Confrontation wasn't my instinct, but gathering truth sometimes meant facing it head on. That evening, I walked to the inn, my heart pounding. Aria opened the door cautiously, the baby on her hip. Her eyes widened when she saw me. "I don't want trouble," she said quickly. "I'm not here for trouble," I replied. "I just need the truth." Her lips tightened, but then she sighed, exhausted. "The truth? Mason lied to me. He promised everything would be ours, his mother's estate, the business, the legacy. But when it all fell to you, he unraveled. He tried to convince me Eleanor had been senile, that you'd manipulated her. He even asked me to testify if it came to that." My stomach clenched. "And would you?" She shook her head firmly. "No, because I saw Eleanor before she died. She told me herself. She trusted you. She said Mason had lost his way. She knew what she was doing." Aria adjusted the baby's blanket. "I left because I didn't want my son growing up in Mason's shadow. He'll try to drag you down, Harper. But he's already drowning." Her words were another stone in my armor. I thanked her and left, the night air sharp against my skin. For the first time in years, I felt not just defended, but fortified. Eleanor's will, Benjamin's documents, the town's observations, her private letters, even Aria's reluctant confirmation, they were all pieces of a shield Mason could never pierce. Back at the Ember House, I locked the doors, brewed a pot of chamomile, and spread the evidence across the counter. Paper, ink, memory, testimony, all of it glowing under the soft light like an altar. Mason thought power came from inheritance, from possession. But real power was this: truth gathered, guarded, ready. As I stacked the papers neatly and slipped them back into their folders, I whispered to Eleanor's memory, "I'm ready now." Because when Mason returned, and I knew he would, I wouldn't just have silence, I'd have proof. And proof, like embers, can burn if pressed into the wrong hands. The night I gathered Eleanor's letters, the legal documents, and Aria's reluctant testimony, something in me shifted. For months I had been surviving, building the Ember House, finding my footing again, proving to myself that I was no longer defined by Mason's shadow. But survival wasn't enough anymore. Mason wasn't going to disappear. He was circling, waiting for me to stumble, waiting for some opening to claw back what his mother had deliberately taken from him. If I wanted to end this, I couldn't just wait behind the counter for him to strike. I needed to move first. I needed to plan. The Ember House became my war room. At night, after closing, I'd spread papers across the counter. Eleanor's letters, the notarized will, my notes from conversations with Charlotte, Caleb, Grace, and Wyatt, even Isla's whispered accounts of Mason's presence around town. Every detail mattered. Mason thrived in ambiguity. My job was to strip it away until nothing remained for him to manipulate. The first step of the plan was information. I called Benjamin Harris again, this time with a sharper edge in my voice. "I want to know exactly how Mason could try to contest the will. Every loophole, every avenue, every trick he might attempt." Benjamin, patient as ever, laid it out. He could claim undue influence, argue Eleanor had been coerced, question her mental capacity, or suggest fraud. But each of those claims would require proof, Benjamin explained. And what you have, medical records, notarized signatures, independent witnesses, even personal letters, it's a fortress. A fortress, I repeated, letting the words settle in my bones. Then, I'll make sure he sees it. The second step was leverage. I didn't just want to defend myself. I wanted Mason to know that every move he made would cost him. That meant pulling threads from his unraveling life. I reached out quietly to contacts in Boston, an old friend of Eleanor's who still moved in the charity circles Mason once tried to dominate. Through her, I learned the truth. His business hadn't just faltered, it had collapsed under debt. Creditors were circling, lawsuits looming. He was desperate not only for Eleanor's estate, but for reputation, for something to polish and parade so people would still see him as Mason Carter, man of stature. That gave me the third step. Timing. Mason cared about appearances more than anything. If I was going to confront him, it had to be public, undeniable. A stage where his charm couldn't spin the story. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Charlotte Hayes mentioned that Maplewood's Fall Festival was coming, a small town tradition, a gathering where every face would appear. Mason had already been asking about it at the diner, likely planning to use the crowd as his stage, a place to posture as though he still belonged. That would be where I drew the line. For days leading up to the festival, I prepared. I created a file, thick, undeniable, containing copies of Eleanor's will, the witness testimonies, the medical reports, and her private letters. I added Aria's written statement, short but devastating. Eleanor told me herself she trusted Harper. She was of sound mind. Mason lied when he said otherwise. Then I made another copy, and another. One stayed with me, one with Benjamin, one with Caleb at the hardware store, and one hidden in the Ember House. Mason could tear at me, but he would never destroy the truth. The final part of my plan wasn't on paper. It was in me. For years, Mason had fed on my silence, my restraint, my reluctance to make a scene. He thrived when I shrank. So my retaliation wouldn't be screaming or vengeance. It would be standing tall in the one way he couldn't, with truth, steady and unshaken. On the eve of the festival, I stood alone in the Ember House, lights low, the smell of cinnamon still clinging to the walls. I pictured Eleanor in her sunroom, shawl over her shoulders, chamomile in her hands. Quiet women carry the heaviest truths, she had told me once. I whispered back into the empty room. Then let the truth be heavy enough to crush him. When morning came, Maplewood's main street filled with laughter, stalls of caramel apples, hay bales stacked for children to climb. The air was crisp, threaded with music and chatter. I wore Eleanor's scarf, a cream shawl soft against my skin, not as armor, but as inheritance, and as I suspected, Mason appeared. Polished just enough to suggest he hadn't lost everything, though the cracks showed in the tired lines around his eyes. Aria wasn't with him. The baby wasn't either. He walked alone, scanning the crowd until his gaze landed on me. He started toward me, ready to perform. But this time, I was ready too. I stepped forward before he could speak, my voice carrying across the chatter. Mason Carter, I said clearly, every head within earshot turning. Before you say a word, let me make something clear. I pulled the folder from my bag, holding it high enough for him and everyone else to see. This is Eleanor Carter's will, signed, notarized, witnessed. These are her medical records proving her sound mind. These are her personal letters written in her hand, naming me as the person she trusted. And this, I added, tapping the final page, is a statement from Aria Reed herself, confirming that Eleanor told her the same. Mason froze, color draining from his face as the whispers rippled through the crowd. "You can circle all you want," I continued, my voice calm but sharp. "You can linger in diners, ask questions in alleys, pretend there's something left for you to claim. But there isn't. Eleanor made her choice, and every attempt you make to deny it only proves what she already knew. You've lost your way." The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was heavy, absolute. Mason's mouth opened, then closed. His fingers twitched at his side, the same tell I remembered from every boardroom where he masked his frustration. But here, in front of Maplewood, there was no mask left. I didn't wait for his answer. I handed a copy of the folder to Benjamin, who stood nearby, then tucked mine back into my bag. "I won't shrink for you anymore," I told Mason, my voice soft enough that only he could hear. "And I won't let you rewrite the story. You've already written your ending. This—" I gestured around at the festival, the Ember House behind me, the people who had stood witness. "Is mine." Mason staggered back, the crowd's eyes heavy on him. For once, he didn't fight, didn't charm, didn't twist. He simply turned and walked away, swallowed by the hum of the festival. I exhaled slowly, steady as stone. The plan had worked. Retaliation hadn't been about destruction. It had been about reclaiming the narrative, planting Eleanor's truth so deeply that Mason could never uproot it. Back at the Ember House that evening, I lit a single candle on the counter. Its flame flickered once, then held. My war wasn't over yet. I knew Mason's pride wouldn't let him vanish entirely. But now the battlefield had shifted. He was no longer circling me. He was circling the truth, and the truth was unshakable. The weeks after the festival felt deceptively calm. The Ember House buzzed as usual, Grace knitting in her corner, Nolan hunched over his textbooks, Wyatt muttering his rare good cup as Bella wagged at his feet. The air smelled of cinnamon and apple pie. The walls glowed golden in the afternoon sun, and for a moment I believed Mason might finally fade into the shadows where he belonged. But men like Mason don't retreat quietly. They wait until they find an audience. It happened on a Saturday morning when Maplewood's town hall hosted its annual community meeting. The room was filled with neighbors, shop owners, farmers, and teachers. The kind of gathering where announcements about road repairs were met with as much passion as discussions about school funding. I went to listen, not to speak, but when I walked in, I saw him. Mason stood near the front, his suit pressed sharper than it had been in months, his posture tall, rehearsed. He caught my eye, and a smirk flickered at the corner of his mouth. I knew that look. He was about to perform. The mayor was mid-sentence about zoning when Mason raised his hand. "If I may," he said, his voice smooth, practiced. "I think this community deserves to know the truth about who's been profiting from Eleanor Carter's estate." The room stilled. Heads turned. My chest tightened, but I stayed quiet. Mason stepped forward, his voice carrying. "My mother, God rest her soul, was manipulated in her final months. She was isolated, persuaded, convinced to sign away her legacy. And now, that legacy sits in the hands of someone who isn't even family anymore." His gaze locked on me, sharp and deliberate. Someone who built her little coffee shop on the ashes of deceit. A murmur rippled through the crowd. My palms burned, but I didn't move. He wanted me rattled, defensive. Instead, I breathed. He pressed on. "I don't blame you for being charmed," he said, turning to the audience. "Harper has always been persuasive, but Maplewood deserves honesty. My mother's estate wasn't meant for a former daughter-in-law who abandoned our family. It was meant for blood." I felt the weight of eyes shifting to me. This was his stage, his attempt to turn the town against me, to reclaim the story. But what he didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment all along. I stood slowly, my scarf slipping from my shoulders as I walked to the front. The wooden floor creaked under my heels, each step deliberate. When I reached the podium, I turned not to Mason, but to the room. "My name is Harper Carter," I began, my voice steady, carrying across the hall. "And I will not let lies bury Eleanor's truth." I lifted the folder from my bag, the same one I'd carried like armor for weeks, and held it high. "This is Eleanor Carter's will, signed, notarized, witnessed by independent parties. This is her medical record, confirming her soundness of mind. These are her personal letters, written in her own hand, naming me as the one she trusted. And this," I said, sliding a page free, "is a statement from Aria Reed herself, confirming Eleanor told her she knew exactly what she was doing." Gasps cut through the room. Mason's smirk faltered. I turned fully toward the crowd. Eleanor wasn't manipulated. She wasn't confused. She was deliberate. She saw Mason clearly. She saw who he had become, and she made her choice. Not to reward me, but to protect her legacy from him. Mason stepped forward, his face flushed. "You expect them to believe—" "They don't have to believe me," I interrupted, my voice sharp as glass. "They only have to read her words." I handed copies of the letters and documents to Benjamin, who had come prepared, standing quietly in the back. He began distributing them down the rows, the paper rustling like a wave of truth cutting through the room. The silence that followed was suffocating for Mason. His eyes darted as neighbors read the documents, their expressions shifting from curiosity to clarity, from doubt to quiet disgust. Charlotte Hayes rose from her seat, her knitting needles tucked in her bag. "I spoke to Eleanor myself before she passed," she said firmly. "She told me she trusted Harper. She said her son had lost his way." Grace Delaney stood next. "Harper didn't take from this town. She gave to it. Ask anyone who stepped foot in the Ember House." One by one, voices rose, not shouting, but steady, undeniable. Wyatt simply said, "Good cup," holding up his mug like a stamp of approval, and the room chuckled, the tension cracking. Mason's face twisted, his composure shattering. "This is slander! This is—" "No!" I said, stepping closer to him, my voice low but carrying. "This is the truth, and the truth doesn't need charm. It doesn't need performance. It stands even when you fall." For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not of me, but of the silence that followed, the weight of a community no longer willing to entertain his illusions. The mayor cleared his throat awkwardly. "Thank you, Harper. I think we've heard enough." The meeting shifted back to its mundane rhythm, potholes and budgets, but Mason didn't speak again. He stood frozen, then turned sharply and stormed out, his footsteps echoing down the hall like the collapse of a man who had finally lost his audience. I remained at the podium for a moment, letting the quiet sink in. Then I returned to my seat, my hands trembling only after I sat. Around me, neighbors smiled, nodded, offered small squeezes of my hand. The Ember House wasn't just my café anymore. It was proof that truth, once spoken aloud, could silence even the loudest lies. And Mason, for all his circling, had finally been forced into the open and undone by the very community he thought he could manipulate. In the days after the town hall meeting, Maplewood seemed to exhale. People who had once whispered now spoke openly. At the diner, Carol poured me coffee on the house and said, "We don't take kindly to men who lie to their mothers and their wives." At the hardware store, Caleb patted the counter and told me, "You're one of us now, Harper. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Mason, on the other hand, became a shadow. The charm that had once carried him through boardrooms and fundraisers evaporated in the face of hard paper and harder truths. The documents spread quickly. Benjamin had seen to that. Everyone in town, and some back in Boston, knew Eleanor's will was ironclad, her letters unshakable. Mason's story collapsed before it could even take root. I heard whispers of creditors tightening their grip, of his former associate stepping back, unwilling to be tied to a man publicly undone. Even Arya's silence spoke volumes. She never returned to him. Without her, without the business, without the estate, Mason was left with only the ruins of the life he had thought untouchable. The Ember House, meanwhile, thrived. More customers came, not out of pity, but because they believed in what it stood for. Grace knit scarves for the winter rush. Nolan brought his classmates to study late into the evening. Wyatt donated old photographs of Maplewood, which I framed and hung on the walls, turning the café into a place of memory as much as warmth. Even Isla started drawing designs for a new logo, shyly handing me sketches of embers glowing in the shape of a heart. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate Mason's fall. But I didn't grieve for him either. The consequences he now faced weren't mine to carry. They were his, born from years of arrogance, deceit, and abandonment. He had chosen this path brick by brick, and now the weight of it pressed down on him alone. As for me, the greatest consequence wasn't his loss. It was my gain. Not in money or property, but in clarity. I had built something of my own, protected it, defended it, and proven not only to the town, but to myself that I could stand without fear. Eleanor had once told me, "Glaciers move so slowly you don't notice until the entire landscape has changed." Now I understood. The landscape of my life was unrecognizable, not because of Mason's absence, but because of my presence. The Ember House glowed each evening like its namesake, a steady flame that no storm could snuff out, and every time I locked the door at night, I whispered into the quiet, "This is mine. This is justice. This is freedom." The first snow of winter fell softly on Maplewood the night I closed the Ember House early. I stood by the window, watching the street lamps catch the drifting flakes, and for the first time in years, my heart was quiet. Not empty, quiet. Inside, the scent of cinnamon still lingered. The mismatched chairs were stacked neatly, and the little brass bell above the door swayed gently as though it carried its own secret rhythm. I thought of Eleanor, of her letters, her steady handwriting, her unwavering belief in me. I thought of Mason, circling somewhere in his own shadows, undone not by me, but by his own choices. And I thought of myself, not the woman who once waited for love that never arrived, but the woman who had built something steady, something warm, from the ashes. I whispered into the silence, "This is only the beginning." And maybe it was, because freedom isn't a finish line. It's a door you choose to walk through again and again, each time with steadier steps. If Harper's story spoke to you, tap like, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about women reclaiming their voices. And maybe, just maybe, share this with someone who needs to be reminded. Sometimes the quietest embers burn the brightest.